In this lecture, we turn to one of the primary causes of most of the environmental problems we face in the future, that being overpopulation. The book concentrates, and I'll use in this lecture an example, major efforts to control population in China that's been going on for the last few decades. To start off with, why do humans, like most creatures, reproduce in the first place? There are inherent biological factors. We as individual organisms are motivated to procreate ourselves and to maintain the species. But humans are interesting in that we also have very complex and evolving socioeconomic factors and considerations. Historically, there were the issues of how to take care of yourself in your old age. In agrarian farming communities and rural communities, still to this day, elderly parents and grandparents are cared for within the home. And so parents would have large families to ensure adequate children to take care of them in their old age. Historically, you might be familiar with some of the Judeo-Christian manifests that were to be fruitful and multiply, and large families are very common historically in Catholic families in areas where birth control currently is not allowed or viewed as impermissible. Overall, we're concerned as much with the total number of people as we are with the growth rate of the population. And that's defined as the percent increase of population size over time. This growth rate is a function of the number of births, deaths, and, depending on the nature of your tally, the number of people moving into or out of a regional population. So in the United States, for example, we'd be concerned with immigration, relatively little emigration or people leaving, as well as native births and deaths to determine the population in the United States. Some of the important terms and concepts you need to be familiar with for this topic. Natality, and you've heard of prenatal care. As you might guess, this has to do with birth. It's defined as the number of individuals added to population strictly through reproduction. The birth rate is that human natality, or the number of added, but it's the number of individuals born per 1,000 per year. And this term, which is fairly specific, numbers born per 1,000 per year, is also referred to as the crude birth rate, or that should be CBR. Crude birth rate, CBR. The mortality is the number of deaths per year. And the death rate, corresponding to the birth rate, is the number of people who die per 1,000 per year, and that's the crude death rate, or CDR. The total fertility rate is the average number of children each woman has over her lifetime. And we'll talk about the factors that influence this as we go on. So these are the terms you should be familiar with, and again, note that birth rate should be crude birth rate and CBR, as opposed to the CDR for death rate. Historically, global human population growth has occurred since the species began, and for hundreds, probably thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years even, the human population was very small and very dispersed. Gradually it grew, and back at the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 years before present, agricultural practices were introduced. People stopped nomadic hunter-gatherer existence, started to raise crops, and then started to raise essentially surplus food, and were able to feed themselves and hold off starvation. And this allowed the first phase of steady but gradual population growth worldwide. So the agricultural revolution was the first major effect and the first major trigger for population growth in the human population. The other one came in the 1700s with the Industrial Revolution, the increase of commercial productivity, further advances in agriculture, the ability to move food where it was needed, and advances in medicine and healthcare that allowed more people to survive longer into life and to have more children as a result that survived as well. Subsequent to that, starting in the 19th century and beyond, the human population growth has undergone a very rapid, almost exponential increase over that time. We've been doubling on shorter and shorter time scales, as you'll see in the time difference between each step of a billion. We're currently at about 7 billion people over that, and the question is where we'll go from here is the question of where the human population is headed globally. This figure is a little easier to consider that factor on. This is an old textbook figure, and again, its projection is a little bit earlier, 2009, of being 7 billion people, but ultimately it shows that growth in the human population, by many estimates, is either going to stabilize at some future population growth that could be 7, 8, 9 billion, could go up as high as 10. Most projections are that it can't go much over 10 or 11 billion simply because the planet's ability to sustain that population is probably going to be reached. And the limits to population growth will become a brake on further increases. Human populations, like any animal population, can also crash due to large-scale disease outbreak, to famine, to war. Any one of a number of catastrophic situations could lead to dramatic decreases in global population, but barring those, most populations or projections suggest that the human population will stabilize somewhere over this century. So what is the current human population? Stepping back about 7 years ago, almost, I looked up the current numbers for the U.S. was 297 million plus. The world population at that time was just under 6.5 billion. Contrast that with earlier, the summer of 2012, and you'll find that the U.S. population has increased by nearly a little over 4 million people, and the world population has increased by over 500 million in just the last 7 years. How do we get these numbers? How do you count that many people? Physically, doing it with a tally sheet and counting noses physically is impossible with the numbers we have nowadays, even in a place like the United States. So much of the population census work that's done is through statistical sampling and various quantitative estimation techniques. Turning back to China and its population growth, historically there was, like most of the world, relatively stable population sizes up to about the year 1500. At that point, new foods were introduced by trade with the West and further advances in medicine, but largely food production, and rapid growth started around that time. There were various famines from time to time that caused the population rate to slow but still increased, and then turning into the latter parts of the 20th century, or middle parts of the 20th century, that population growth rapidly started to increase up to its current high levels. What came with that was the fact that the standard of living in China has improved greatly over the last 50 years. In fact, you're probably well aware of the large rate of economic growth, the rise of middle class and affluence over larger numbers of population members in China. But in the second half of the 20th century, there was itself a very significant increase in the life expectancy. Where it had been as low as 45 years, it increased to approximately 60 years. And that increase was responsible for rapidly growing the population, as well as the increase of child or live births and child survival. The crude death rate in China fell, but the crude birth rate at the same time held steady. So by 1970, China's population had increased dramatically to nearly 900 million people and was observed to be rapidly heading towards 1 billion people in just one country. The period where populations undergo large changes in their death rate and birth rate is referred to a demographic transition. And other countries, especially those in Europe, the United States, have gone through that from situations where they had high birth and high death rates to lower birth rates and lower death rates. And so that transition is what China is going through now from the standpoint of trying to deal with the economic and environmental changes that accompany that, plus feeding that many people. It's worth noting that China currently supports about a quarter of the world's population with only 7% of the arable land on the planet that's suitable for growing crops, producing livestock and other foodstuffs. Now the question is, do you believe with further growth that that's sustainable? You should consider the consequences of things like climate change, disease outbreak, lots of different issues that can affect the ability of the Chinese, country of China's natural resources and environment to sustain that large a population that's still growing. And so the impacts that came with this were increasingly felt in the susceptibility to famine. Approximately 30 million people starved through famine throughout the 1950s. Recall that this was also the time of large political change with Mao Zedong and the communist Chinese takeover and transition to government centralized control of farming and industry. And by 1970s, there were such severe shortages in consumer goods that rationing had to be introduced. The government recognized and blamed this on overpopulation and started to take steps to deal with the problem. And by the 1970s, it was very clear that a couple of major demographic properties of the Chinese population were going to be important. 2/3 of the population by that time was under the age of 30, and that put men and women in their prime reproductive years. And that just the people born in the 50s and 60s alone were entering their reproductive years and were going to probably further increase the population growth. And note also that due to food production improvements, and especially as the political climate became under control, even though severe control, food production increased, and that the death rate was declining, and large-scale famines were, if not eliminated, were greatly reduced. So the overall crude death rate was declining with increased potential for further growth through birth in the Chinese population. And this was all recognized in the 1970s. By 1979, China took an unprecedented step and issued a government decree, and this has been severely enforced through economic and legal sanctions. No family could have more than one child. And if you've read in the news or heard, one of the things of Chinese culture is a premium placed on male children. And so there have been some rather tragic stories of the effect of this on female infants. But this policy had large ramifications not only on the crude birth rate, but also in the gender makeup, which we'll look at, of the Chinese population. And this had very significant implications for the future of Chinese, both economically and population-wise. The goal of this was to achieve essentially zero population growth, to find a replacement level of birth rates to match the death rates, and try and stabilize the population, which was already very, very large in the sense that it's a quarter of the population in just a single country. In the next lecture, we'll look at some of the principles of demographics and population studies. In the second part of the lecture, we're going to be looking at some of the principles of population dynamics. Two things in particular we're going to look at are the population age structures of various countries, and also the gender or sex ratios and the implications they have for reproductive progress. Going back to our last lecture, we had the notion of zero population growth. And this takes place, or the condition arises, when the number of people being born is equal to the number of people dying. And this, remember we talked about a fertility rate reaches approximately 2, or the number of women, or number of children born per woman is right about 2. Actual fertility, replacement fertility, is approximately 2.1, or a fraction, due to accidental death or other early death of children. In order to reach that condition, there are 2 steps been recognized. First, you have to identify why birth rates are high in a growing population in order to change them. And second, through policies and incentives, and in the case of China, active restrictions, you have to take steps to reduce the birth rates. These age structure diagrams that are developed in demographic studies can be used to predict future growth potential of a population. This is the Chinese age structure diagram as of 2005. What you see are a smaller number of children, or excuse me, a smaller numbers of males and females at the youngest ages at the bottom of the diagram. There's a middle level. The highest numbers of males and females are in those middle age, early to middle age categories, and then approximately 2% of the population of females are at that 65 to 69 age range. And this is considered a transitional type from very rapid growth to a more mature, stable population rate or growth rate. 2 things that the age structure diagram can show you is the structure of the ages, meaning the population of the various age groups, and also the sex ratio or the gender ratio, and that's the number of males per 1,000 females. So equal numbers would be 1, and numbers above 1 would be a higher percentage of a higher percentage of males to females in the population. So a review question to look at these age diagrams, and I encourage you to read the book on this. It's a fairly good discussion here. So looking at countries A, B, and C, which of these 3 countries has the highest capacity for growth and is likely to experience the highest growth rate? Country A, B, or C, or, given somewhat similar conditions in A and B, countries A and B. And I'll leave you to review this in the book and determine your answer. Secondly, and conversely, which of these countries or countries would you classify as mature and likely to experience a stable population growth? And again, you should review this in the book and come up with your answer. You should note that many industrialized nations, the so-called developed countries in the world today, have top-heavy age structure diagrams with many older people relative to the number of younger people, and the United States is a good example of this. If you look at the population distribution by age, this chart shows the U.S. on the left and the California on the right. You'll note that we have a somewhat younger population, although the number of females are likewise greater than the number of males surviving into older age, and this changes from the early years of the age of the population. But in both cases, we don't have that broad base that you saw in the earlier diagrams. Ours has a more uniform distribution across the first 30 or 40 years, and recall, especially in the case of women, what are the prime age fertility years of ages. Typically it's going to be that very late teens to late 30s in cases of the United States, where more women are having children later in life. But this age distribution is important from the standpoint of how much of the population is in that childbearing years. One of the problems we face in countries that have these rapidly aging populations is that the financial basis for retirement, the expectation of comfortable financial circumstances has increased dramatically over the last several decades, and that the baby boomers, those that were born immediately following for the next decade or so after World War II, that's the baby boom generation. And the concern they have is, one, they'll be living longer and needing Social Security and other retirement incomes much later in life as the average lifespan in the United States increases with more advanced health care. So funding Social Security is an ongoing debate, and one that you all in this class should be paying attention to, because you may well be carrying a working burden through your lifetimes that will have in that you'll be supporting through your Social Security taxes future generation, or the previous generation, your parents' generation and grandparents' generation. Another factor is that you may see conditions in the U.S., and I think you are seeing more people working later in life, as in where France raised the official retirement age from 60 to 62. Concerns over Social Security and other later in life financial resources have more senior folks working later and taking part-time jobs to supplement their retirement income. In China, the age structure diagram has changed since the 1979 beginning of the one-child policy. By 1982, or only 3 years later, about 5% of the population were older than 65. It's projected that by 2050, that percentage will increase to 15% will be older. And again, this is due to better health care, greater food access, and improved living conditions. And again, this is the population on average. Rural populations, poor populations will not necessarily enjoy the same benefits as those benefiting from the current economic growth. And there's also been a notable change in the gender or sex ratio of males to females over this time frame. The ratio in 1979 was 1.06, and this is closer to the norm worldwide. By 2011, that ratio had increased to 1.17. And again, this has to do with the cultural preference for male children, and again, some of the practices of putting female children up for adoption or simply terminating pregnancies where they're able to determine a female child was coming. But ultimately, combination of the one-child policy plus gender preferences in the population have greatly increased this male to female ratio, and this has implications for the availability of women for marriage in the future. Going forward, compared to historic times, there are going to be fewer adult children to care for their aging parents, grandparents, and relatives. And a more immediate concern in the current economic climate, there are fewer young workers, and trying to sustain the rapid economic growth and increase in affluence and world position, China is going to be increasingly concerned about this lack of a young workforce. And males will be finding it more difficult for women to marry, and that will have implications for social structures that probably the implications to date aren't fully known. With these issues and the increasing recognition that there need to be changes, the government in China has begun to reconsider the one-child policy and starting to allow select couples to have a second child. This concludes the second part of our lecture. You should move on to the third and the final. In this third and final section of this lecture on population, we will be considering what the future is going to be like. We're going to consider where we're at with regard to the global population growth rate, consider some of the future projections, and then talk about some of the issues surrounding that growth, meaning the carrying capacity, how many people the Earth can sustain, and what are some of the consequences of that growth. Because clearly you'll find in some places in this country direct evidence of large populations, dense urban crowding, crowded beaches. At the same time, you'll find areas in the rural parts of the country, the United States, regions where there are very few people living and the population pressures are not felt. However, we are one connected planet nowadays increasingly, and so the global population has implications for humans regardless of where they are and which country they reside in. So you might recall there's a population growth rate, the rate at which global population is growing. That growth curve, which we'll see again, is still increasing depending on the x-axis and the way you portray time, but the rate at which the population is growing is slowing. The growth rate is declining and has been doing so for the last 30 or 40 years. The problem is when you're at 7 billion people, small growth is still growth, and small increments of large populations still are adding large numbers of people for net growth, which has implications for further increases in the world population. One of the main ideas in this class that you need to think about, because you have a contribution to make to it, is that the environment that we live in globally and locally, has a carrying capacity. And that's the maximum population size that an area can support. Chances are, in your local community, you've seen or heard debate over growth. Growth of a city, growth of a town, growth of the population in the state, of the country. And so the debate over population growth is very interesting with people who believe that we can, especially when they have an economic interest in building housing developments, should just be allowed to grow. And don't necessarily think about the fact that there are inherent limits to growth. The response I have when in the debate locally in the Chico area over growth, which currently Chico has about 100,000 people, and the current economic climate is growing slowly, if at all. It's a singular community surrounded by rural and agricultural lands, not a lot of growth, not a lot of industry to support growth, but will grow as a commuter town. And so the maximum current population capacity, from a planning perspective, is the general plan for the city of Chico is the build out would be at about 135,000 people, or roughly another third as many people that live here currently. And so developers who own land and would like possibly to see that number increased will engage in debate with people who believe that that number is too high and that we should stabilize where we are. The question I have within a debate like that runs like this. Could you support the entire population of the planet, 7 billion people, in and around Chico? And that's admittedly and intentionally an absurd question. There's no way 7 billion people could stand in the footprint of Chico, let alone reside and be supported there. And so then let's drop it back and say, could you support 1 million people? Drop down some orders of magnitude. And that likewise, if you think of the population, that being populations of large portions of the Bay Area, that's completely unreasonable. So immediately, when you use extreme examples like that, I think you can demonstrate that there are inherent limits to growth. The question then comes is, how big can populations grow? And in part, that goes back to this question of carrying capacity. And the maximum population size that an area can support is really more of a survival-based concept. How many people can survive in the long term in an area based on local or available resources without having to resort to large-scale importation of food, water, energy, and so on. So if you look at survival and basic support as being the idea of the carrying capacity, is that the upper limit that you want to face in your community, in your state, in the country, in the world? Because even though 7 billion or 10 billion people might be possible to sustain in the world, in places like Asia and Africa, there are large discrepancies between the size of the population and the ability of the local area to support them. And in many places in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a great dependence on outside aid and continuing foods brought in to sustain those populations. So sustainability of populations is very artificial in some places around this area. And we're going to look more at the ecological footprint in future lectures as we come through this. So again, to recap, there's approximately 7 billion planet on Earth today, and by many accounts we may be at or have already exceeded the carrying capacity of the Earth to sustain those, especially given the prospect of climate change, that changing climates may change rainfall patterns in the future and create drought in areas and diminish food supplies, that we are barely able to feed the whole planet today on an adequate basis and a healthy basis, and that future climate change, if it diminishes that food supply, means that we won't be able to sustain even the current population, let alone if that population were to grow to 8 or 9 or 10 billion people. So this notion of carrying capacity is one that we need to think about. So what determines what the carrying capacity of a region, a location, the planet, as far as how many people can survive in the long term? First off is the availability of raw materials. And that includes foods, but also energy, building materials, and just about all the types of different materials that human society consumes. Second is the availability of energy. And as noted earlier, we're highly dependent on fossil fuels, which are not necessarily sustainable. Third is the accumulation of waste products. With all that population growth comes sewage waste, landfill, municipal waste, emissions to air, emissions to water, dumping on grounds and the soils, and all those waste products have the potential to adversely impact the fertility and productivity of the landscape and the environment. Think about the waste you have in the house around you in terms of materials that you end up throwing away or that may accumulate by virtue of the products that you throw out. And then finally, and one that may ultimately be a major control on human population, but is interactions among organisms. Recall that the Greenland Vikings, for example, had neighboring indigenous peoples that they could have learned from and improved their prospects of survival, but did not engage with them in a positive way and were in hostile relations, and ultimately did not have good interaction with other human populations. And obviously in places around the world we have local conflict, but local conflict, certainly in the nuclear age with certain countries, has the prospect of developing into even limited nuclear weapon exchange. And of course, alliances and political connections are such that it's hard to know if, say, a Middle Eastern conflict breaks out, how it might spread or who might become involved. Likewise, you can have major social unrest and major violence in urban populations under varying situations and in response to tragic events. And ultimately, it's that totality of the social interaction that will affect the death rate. People in war, obviously, but just the sheer numbers of people that live nowadays and travel is a major avenue for the spread of contagious diseases, potentially, and is a global concern in terms of prospect for catastrophic disease outbreak. So what are the limits to growth? Well, there's a theoretical limit, and that comes down to this notion of carrying capacity. It's not not apparent that we've reached it yet, although we may find evidence of that in the near future, but it's still a concern. Then there is the question of the standard of living. How many people would you want living in an area to maintain a livable environment? Let's go back to Chico, which is a relatively small town, if you could think of it as such, at about 100,000 people. It's not crowded, there's not much traffic here, but if you increase that population significantly, then a lot of the properties and characteristics of Chico, the small town, will disappear, and the standard of living, as many people value it, will diminish. So those are kind of a socioeconomic and aesthetic consideration that enters into what and how we configure population growth. How do you define your own standard of living? Is it based on the food and the food choices you have, being able to get fresh fruits and vegetables year-round, whether they come from Chile or from the southern San Joaquin Valley or from your local farmer's market? If you take fast food and other so-called aspects of modern American life and import those around the world, what kind of standard of living expectation is growing in other countries that see what America has, thanks to advertising success, view that as being something to strive and want, and then to bring into their own culture? Are you going to be seeking your own home someday, and is it going to be targeted, as has the last two generations, that the average home size has grown substantially from 1,100 square feet to 1,400 square feet to 18 or 2,000 square feet over the last two generations? And there's a question of whether your generation and beyond will be able to continue that trend. What sort of vehicle are you going to seek, and how would you define that as either an active goal or measure of what sort of standard of living you want? Students I've known have worked long hours and actually put their academic success at risk to own a vehicle, to pay for a car loan while they're still in school. But beyond that, carrying debt to own vehicles is the way of the future. Obviously, the electronic age and the dated view of this early iPod, we increasingly like technological toys. They allow us to be more productive. We relate our happiness to them in our pastimes and our social networking, but the electronic age is one that we live in that has implications for what we consume and what we demand as a part of our standard of living. And then, of course, the energy we use to run all this and to support all this. All of these items that we've talked about in this slide have an energy cost. And the places we live in, large urban areas, frequently have tremendous energy consumption and have a need to increase their efficiency and their conservation of energy if they're going to maintain sustainable energy supplies. You can find brownout periods in summers in California, most summers on really hot weather, because our electrical generating capacity is very close to demand, and on peak demands has trouble even keeping up. So clearly, our standard of living and our expectations in the future typically does not include less material property or less energy use or a lower material standard of living, but that has implications as there are more of us in this country as well. So when we look to the future, there is the question of where we're going to end up. And if life is what it is its current condition, at 7 billion people, every additional billion people that are added to the planet are largely going to be in places where the resources are increasingly inadequate to support those. And ultimately, the shortages, the famine, potentially mass death, disease, conflict, all of those have implications for all of us as we grow further. And so whenever we can stabilize the population, let alone reduce the global population, we face continued strains worldwide in the environment and in the human environment as well. And again, I can't stress this enough, that one of the major problems we face with this growing population is that most of the growth that we've seen to date and the economic benefits we've achieved with the growth of modern developed society has been supported by non-renewable energy resources. And not only is their supply finite, the demand for those resources has increased dramatically with population growth in China and India, especially as two very large populations with growing consumer consumption. So depending on our total fertility rate worldwide will have a large impact on what we have in the way of a final global population that's either sustainable or one that will lower itself through some sort of correction. But it's this total fertility rate, or the total number of children born to women in the future worldwide, not just in developed countries like the US and Europe and places like that, that's going to have a large impact on the final stabilized population number. One of the keys, especially in developing countries, that demographers and those who study populations view is social justice issues. Education of women, allowing women to have greater control over their reproductive futures, which involves social change, cultural change, even religious change, and the role of women in the future in terms of the social justice that they experience has a big impact on the future family sizes, how many children women will have, and the social networks that they have to support them in lieu of just more children to support them later in life. So a few questions for you to consider as we wrap this lecture up. How many people do you believe that the Earth can sustain? Are we maxed out now? Do you see us being able to grow further? And where do you see that population growth occurring? Again, I would direct you to the book on this. There's very good sections on the differences of population growth in developed countries versus developing countries. What sort of living conditions do you foresee with population growth? And you can consider that in the context of California, your hometown, wherever that may be, the United States, and certainly globally. And how will you personally be affected by the projected global population growth? Because the rate is, as we noted, although the population growth rate is diminishing, the population is growing. There are more people and more demand on resources, and that will have implications for you and your future in this economic, social, and environmental world we live in. And so that population growth, like I say, has implications for you and may provide, there may be future choices that you'll have to make or choose to make in terms of working on issues related to population to try and impose some control on that future. And finally, you should be able to describe at least 4 consequences of rapidly expanding human populations, whether they be at the local scale, regional, national, or world scale. This concludes our third part of the lecture, and you should move on now to the next lecture topic.